Good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to the Institute for Mediterranean Studies and Alexandria Center for Hellenistic Studies Neoplatonic lectures. We are greatly honored that our speaker today is Professor Harold Tarrant. Professor Tarrant needs no introduction. However, I will attempt to say a few words. Professor Tarrant has studied at the universities of Cambridge and Durham, but he has spent major part of his career at the University of Sydney and Newcastle, Australia. Since where he's Professor Emeritus, and since 2012, I think, he has retired to live in Cambridge in the UK. His main interest is, of course, Plato and the Platonic tradition, and more especially the intersection of literature and Platonic philosophy from Socrates to late Neoplatonism. He is member of the International Plato Society, of the International Society for Neoplatonic Studies, of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Plato, and of several bodies that promote the study not only of ancient philosophy, but also of classical studies, as he also has interests in aspects of Greek drama, comedy more especially, Aristophanes, and of the ancient novel. He has published more than 160, I think, journal articles and book chapters, and he is author or editor, often with others, of 17 books, I think, including a monograph on Plato's second Alcibiades, which is currently in proof with Parmenides Publishing. Some of the book titles include Brill's Companion to the Reception of Plato in Antiquity, Proclus' Commentary on Plato's Timaeus, books 1 and 5, the Platonic Alcibiades the First, Second Sailing, Alternative Perspectives on Plato, the Neoplatonic Socrates, Plato, The Last Days of Socrates, Plato's First Interpreters, Proclus on Plato's Kratilos, Olympiodorus on Plato's Gorgias, and the list goes on and on. So today's talk is going to be on Olympiodorus, as well as Professor Tarrant will talk on growing the profile of Platonic studies in Olympiodorus Alexandria. Harold, thank you very much for having accepted this invitation, and we are eager to listen to you. I'm going to share your handout, and the floor is yours.
So, well, I can start by saying congratulations on this series from Athens to Alexandria. It's a subject dear to my heart. Thanks very much for inviting me to participate in it, and we'll see how it goes. I keep going back to Olympiodorus, but I've come to the conclusion that in a perversion of Heraclitus's words, Olympiodorus crypten philae. He doesn't always like to reveal his full hand, I think. Yes, we have a handout there. Good. I apologize also for those whose Greek may be a bit shaky, that I haven't translated all the passages on the handout, but I'll probably be giving at least a rough sense of what is in them as we go along, so nobody should be totally left behind here. So I started out thinking that what I wanted to do was to present a tale of two great philosophers. I don't mean Aristotle and Plato, but rather Ammonius, who Olympiodorus refers to as the great philosopher 15 times in his commentary on the Meteorologica, where he also calls him his predecessor, and Olympiodorus himself, referred to as the great philosopher in the headings of the Gorgias commentary and the Alcibiades commentary. It may be that the title was reserved for the acknowledged head of the Alexandrian school, but I take it that nobody was forced to use it. The interesting difference is that Ammonius and Olympiodorus seem to have won the better part of their reputation by interpreting different authors, Aristotle and Plato respectively. We have no commentary on a Platonic text from Ammonius, and Olympiodorus is responsible for the 2 whole and 1 partial commentaries on Platonic text that came from the Alexandrian school. The Prolegomena Philosophiae of David and Elias are an indication of the growing prominence of Plato, I think. For both David and Elias discuss various concepts of philosophy, seemingly valuing those associated with Plato at least as highly as those associated with Aristotle. One may thus assume that Olympiodorus's teaching of Plato was admired by followers in the school. On 3 occasions, that's 16:3, 31:34, and 63:32, David's Prolegomena refer respectfully to Olympiodorus, twice calling him the philosopher. Here I should like to suggest that we can trace in Olympiodorus something of a development away from the more Aristotelian philosophical framework that was inherited from Ammonius, and towards a rather more independent stance where Plato had come to dominate in the mix. In a study of the terminology of argument, proof, and refutation, just published in the history of philosophy and logical analysis, I came to the conclusion that it was likely that Olympiodorus's commentaries were composed in the following order, and that is handout 1. When I got to the end of the list, I couldn't really differentiate much between the commentary on the Phaedo and the commentary on Aristotle's Meteorologica, but on the sort of the test that I applied there, which are only a fraction of the tests one could apply to such works, those 2 texts constantly came out quite similar. So first of all, then, the commentary on Plato's Gorgias, which, although we've got no independent evidence for it, has this early feel about it. It seems more dependent than most works on Ammonius. It doesn't seem as if it's taking much notice at all of anybody in the Athenian school. Then the commentary on Aristotle's categories, simply because it's not so far removed from the commentary on the Gorgias. Then the commentary on Plato's Alcibiades, one which now shows the influence of Proclus and Damascius quite clearly, and is on the whole a lot more adventurous than the commentary on the Gorgias. And finally, the commentary on the Phaedo and on the Meteorologica. The Meteorologica is certainly written late, can be confidently placed beyond about the 60th year of Olympiodorus's life, I think, by a reference to a comet appearing in 565. In order to have studied without Ammonius, he must by then have been over the age of 60. So while Olympiodorus was always committed to the role of argument, the general trend when discussing argument was away from the use of the terminology of syllogistic, and particularly away from syllogizing Plato's arguments, away from talk of proof and refutation, and towards argument for and against a thesis. So it sounds as if he's less prepared to acknowledge that an argument proves something or disproves something by the end of his life. In a study that's yet to appear, I also draw attention to what I consider to be a slightly skeptical trend in late Olympiodorus, or at least a greater consciousness of hints of uncertainty in Platonic texts. Chiara Militello kindly sent me a reference to the commentary on the Meteorologica, where the use of eulabeia in such circumstances. This is on handout B there, and I give the Meteorologica passage first. He added this word skedon either through the portion of philosophy, I had to say that means the caution appropriate to philosophy, or because he didn't actually give all the figures of the comets. So explaining away this term skedon in the Aristotelian text. Now, there are only 4 cases of eulabeia in Olympiodorus, one that is not comparable in the Alcibiades commentary, where Socrates is said to be approaching Alcibiades cautiously so as not to scare his quarry away, but 2 comparable ones in the commentary on the Phaedo, which I've given you there, 2 under handout B, starting off uk endoiasdo to ACHS. It's not out of doubt that he wrote ACHS, but he introduced the isos to alethes gnosomatha diulabean, the words perhaps we shall know the truth. So that's from the Platonic text. Out of eulabeia, cautiousness. So again, this Platonic cautiousness appears, and he contrasts that with a passage elsewhere in the Phaedo, reference to adamantine bonds. Again, but later in the commentary on the Phaedo, there's the 3rd passage, and it's a commentary on Plato 69 D5. and where Socrates says, we shall, once we are there, we will know clearly whether we've got anywhere. And this, the idea is that Socrates is not saying this out of ignorance and in doubt, but out of this philosophical cautiousness. So that's both an interesting feature of Olympiodorus. One wonders particularly how appropriate he considered cautiousness to be for a philosopher, particularly for an Alexandrian philosopher working in an essentially Christian world. One can also point to the fact that this is another connection between the commentary on the Meteorologica and the Phaedo commentary. Now, Olympiodorus does not wish to credit Plato or his Socrates with skepticism, but he does want them to display this philosophic caution, which has the result of mitigating any impression of an immodest certainty. This fits quite well with his willingness to use arguments for both sides in a debate and to seek an answer that may lie somewhere in the middle, something particularly in evidence in the discussion of suicide at the beginning of the surviving chunk of Phaedo commentary. My impression is one of somebody who has lost faith, perhaps, in straightforward syllogisms on account of the problems of determining which premises are true and in what circumstances. So the commentary on the Phaedo also tends to mock Aristotelian attachment to the syllogism at one point, and Plato himself refers to the argument as a mythos at Phaedo 70 B6, and this is taken as seriously undermining the syllogistic upon which the peripatetic prided itself so much. And there's handout C, I give you the passage there. So that you might say, so that as for the syllogistic method upon which the peripatetic prides himself, Plato has called it a myth. So, and the reason given is that syllogisms are reliant upon a middle term, so it spells out into a story, as it were, but thus it's approaching reality only indirectly. And I think I've given you, perhaps I had, but the whole passage at 10:3, 1-6 is worth taking a look at. It also seems to be the case that in the prolegomena to logic, placed before the categories commentary, Olympiodorus prefers the Platonic concentration on proving things without attention to syllogistic figures to the opposite procedure that he associates with Aristotle. So he associates Aristotle with giving all his attention to the syllogistic figures and less on the actual content of the argument, if you see what I mean. So overall, there's little doubt that Olympiodorus is moving towards giving Plato prominence rather than Aristotle in the crucial area of proof. Indeed, even the seemingly early On the Gorgias had explained most of the failings of Socrates' interlocutors in terms of their distance from the common notions, viewed in much the same way as Platonic recollectable knowledge. The one thing that we should avoid here is attributing too much authority to any one philosopher, in spite of the fact that Olympiodorus may be moving away from Aristotle to Plato. Olympiodorus had learnt early that the truth is dearer than Socrates, and that one is only obliged to believe Plato's words if those words are proven. That's on the Gorgias 41:9. However, if Olympiodorus was to rehabilitate a plausibly Platonic philosophy, he had to do so in more ways than just looking at knowledge and epistemology. I have also argued that his school has dropped the supremacy of the Parmenides in theology and now sees the Timaeus as the supreme theological dialogue. While this would be a major rejection of much that was held dear by the Athenian school, perhaps rendering virtually the whole of Proclus's Platonic theology as without any foundation in reality, it is certainly a position that many a generation of Platonists would think wholly appropriate, giving the Timaeus authority rather than the Parmenides in theology. So what does Olympiodorus make of the Timaeus? And it's rather difficult to say a lot here. How, if at all, does his position differ from the position of Asclepius, his contemporary and pupil of Ammonius, who can be expected to adopt a line more characteristic of Ammonius? The handout D then gives some possible some passages where that seem to be relevant to the use of the Timaeus in the Phaedo commentary in particular, and there's other such uses as one goes along. A similar range of uses is also found in the commentary on the Alcibiades, which lacks, however, the longer quotations, but probably only allusions are found in the Gorgias commentaries. So there's maybe a trend towards using the Timaeus a little bit more openly as Olympiodorus goes along. There's not a lot to go on, especially for theology, but one thing that I've not found is any clear allusions to such things as the receptacle, as when Asclepius uses the characteristic terms tithene and pandekes at his commentary on the Metaphysics 50:17-19. So that's something that Asclepius refers to quite obviously. But on the whole, such issues don't seem to concern Olympiodorus so much. I think it's worth looking, though, at references to the Demiurge. First of all, perhaps let's have a look at what Asclepius is doing, and which we might suppose to be more characteristic of the what Ammonius would have in mind. The term demiurge is found in the singular 38 times. There are also 33 references in Asclepius to demiurgikoi logoi. That is the creative formal principles or something like that, the demiurgikoi logoi. So that's a real theme in Asclepius. with a few other references to the adjective too, half a dozen references to the use of the verb demiurgein, and four of the abstract noun demiurgia. Asclepius quotes the speech of the demiurge to the young gods at on the Metaphysics 194, and continues to paraphrase until 195.3. If I interpret him correctly here, he is regarding the heavenly beings just created beforehand as identical with the young gods to whom the address of the demiurge is directed there. And one can have a look at handout E here. So first of all, metagar fesi to poiesai ta urania epe prosauta theoi theon, and so on. So there's the address to the young gods, and he's says that this he's addressing this to ta urania, so to the heavenly beings, if you like. And then you can see 194, 17 to 18. Tu toinon ae enai ten genesin aitios fesin, estin hotheos, tes diphthorras, kai tes genesios aitia ta urania, ton di kathekastas socratus kai alkibio du hoi gones hos atomon. The key thing here is that whereas God, that is, and must be the demiurge himself in Asclepius's eyes here, he is responsible for generation always going on, there always being generation. The cause of the destruction and the generations, and the causes of destruction and generation are these heavenly beings, and of course you've got the parents are the causes of the individuals such as Socrates and Alcibiades, which we don't have to worry about much. It seems to be picking on ta urania as the young gods. Asclepius can be quite specific, it seems, compared with Olympiodorus a lot of the time. There's a lot of other divine attributes in Asclepius which are worth mentioning. There on the handout, first of all, goodness, not surprisingly, as in the Timaeus. The ideas are treated as the thoughts of the demiurge at 69:24 to 26. Alla to en allo kai allo onti Platoni makatai, toi supotethemenois tas ideas tautas autas kathiautas hyparkusas kai usas kekorismenas tu nu. So he has the idea that the Aristotelian polemic is directed, in fact, to the people who are separating out the ideas from intellect. Here, ideas give rise to the creative logoi, and then they're passed down to phusis, as we read at 70:26 to 29. Hagar phusis uden estin heteron elampsis ekathen prousa. So nature is nothing other than the illumination coming forth from there and shining upon things here, and having within it here's your demiurgikoi logoi again, the formal principle, the formal creative principles. Umentoige epistrefusa prosiautein. So that's one thing that physis doesn't do. It doesn't revert upon itself. Okay. Asclepius compares these logoi as they function in God, in us, and in nature in an interesting passage at 81. Still in handout F. Ekusenu. God and the soul and nature possess the logoi, but God has both cognitive and creative principles, whereas the soul has cognitive principles and nature has creative principles. So that's another instance of the use of these creative and cognitive principles. I think we'll skip that. Plato's, in particular, note that Plato's demiurge is using the ideas as paradigms at 365, 1-5. Prosha aphoro, looking away to which the demiurge produces what he produces. So that's the general idea. And again, at the end of this passage, eis has apoblepein ho demiurgos parage ha poier, looking away to which the demiurge produces what he creates. We actually get a clear idea in Asclepius of the relation between the creator God and the ideas or paradigms which he uses to create. Okay, let me find where we are. So the overall impression is that Asclepius is reading Plato's metaphysical legacy in a somewhat middle Platonic manner. In particular, note that God in the singular and with the article is found over 60 times, whereas gods in the plural and with the article is found only once, and then in relation to the plurality of gods mentioned by Parmenides in B13. I take it that mentioning Parmenides B13 does not constitute any kind of proof that Asclepius himself acknowledges the existence of a plurality of gods. And he doesn't ever refer to a plurality of demiurges either, and we've seen how he treats the young gods. Olympiodorus is a bit more flexible than this, and as I say, Olympiodorus crupten phile, he's not so keen on revealing his full hand. Indeed, any commentator on Plato probably has to be a bit flexible when it comes to God and gods, because Plato uses the two without very much discrimination. Hence, God with the article is found 26 times in the Gorgias commentary, 34 and 34 times in the Alcibiades commentary, mostly relating to the original text, and 8 times in the Phaedo commentary. It's found only once in the commentary on the Meteorologica, which actually uses the gods in the plural twice. First of all, when speaking of Homer's gods, and secondly, in the phrase, the iris among the gods, to distinguish her from the rainbow. They're not clear instances of a belief in polytheism, I think. All Platonic commentaries are prepared to use the gods in the plural, though the most notable instances are in the Alcibiades commentary. Here in the life of Plato, we meet tois eke theos, referring to the local gods on Hymettus. We also meet an example relating to the Palinode of the Phaedrus at 17:9, a division of gods into hypercosmic and various classes of encosmic at 19:13, which sounds as if it's a bit more like what we would expect from the Athenian school than we generally get. A discussion on which gods a discussion on which gods one ought least to swear falsely by at 88:17 as a result of the lemma in the Alcibiades. There's an attribution of blessedness to the gods at 131:10, and the observation that all gods are in Zeus fashion, and in Hera fashion, etc. at 2:14:13. In the Gorgias commentary, examples are mainly in quotations, and one in the Pandora story, also 48:7. And in the Phaedo commentary, there are cases at 17:24 and 2:6, but all relate to the use at Phaedo 62b7, so it doesn't seem terribly significant. So undoubtedly the most significant uses of the plural gods in Olympiodorus seems to be in the Alcibiades commentary, where one feels he is most under the influence of material from Proclus and Damascus. Even so, there's little doubt that a single god always dominates, usually identifiable with the demiurge of the Timaeus or something like it. Regarding the actual term demiurge, one has to be careful to exclude references to human craftsmen in the Gorgias commentary, but one may still find 6 independent passages of relevance there. In other commentaries, the Phaedo commentary has 5, the Alcibiades commentary 4, the Categories commentary 3, and there's 1 in the Meteorologica commentary. So Olympiodorus has no problem with referring to a demiurge. Indeed, there's an interesting case where he rejects the odd view that the skopos of the Gorgias is about the demiurge. This should be there on the handout. Yeah, okay. Under G on the handout. So you have alloe de legusi otiskopone ke peritu demiurgu dialecthenai. Others say that he has the intention of discussing about the demiurge, and these people take up the skopos from a part, since in the myth as we are able to learn, he mentions the demiurge. What is Olympiodorus actually doing here? This is a passage that's sort of worried me for some time. The anonymous prolegomena seems to refer to the same theory using different terminology, the terminology of an intellect that sees itself, 2257. And that passage is also there, peri tu hiauton horontos nu. That is what seems to be the version of the same thing, and it is worded quite different, isn't it? Now, this may remind one that the lowest member of Amelius's triad of divine intellects was an intellect that sees, identified by Proclus with Chronos. Amelius found his demiurgic triad at Timaeus 39, so the intellect that sees must have been one face of the demiurge, an aspect that sees the intelligibles within the intellect that is the intelligibles, another face, so to speak. It looks almost as if Olympiodorus might be covering up here the fact that the creator God had in fact been regarded as triple in Amelius. So he just wants to refer simply to the craftsman when we have evidence elsewhere that the situation's more complicated. He himself says that they inferred that this was the skopos from the myth of the Gorgias, and he does refer to the god who controls the punishment later as demiurge at 49:6, leaving it quite unclear as to whether this is to be identified with Zeus or with Kronos, a god, or rather intellective power, about whom he had much to say at 47:3-4. There is one passage, however, of the Alcibiades commentary that does draw a distinction between intellect and God when looked at internally within the individual. And here this is down on handout H. And this interprets what Socrates is trying to say to Alcibiades at 133, looking into mine, you will find within it divine statues, that is intellect and God, and through the intellect you will activate yourself in cathartically, whereas through the God you will activate yourself contemplatively. For there is in it, there is in my mind, a God by relation, or a God by its temporary possession of a divine-like character. And through the illumination of intellect, we have the common notions, whereas through the illumination of God, we have inspirations. So this passage is really quite helpful for showing us how Olympiodorus can be suggesting that nous isn't, there's not a simple identity of nous and God, that you could have nous doing one thing and God doing another, and as a result you might be able to have choros nous, which is how he regards chronos, as doing something rather different from the demiurge, which I presume is how he regards Zeus rather. Anyway, the fact that is that the Gorgias commentary is shy of anything that seems polytheistic, and I think here in Olympiodor in I've got some other Olympiadoran passages relevant to God, but I start off with what seems to be the shadow of Aristotle's Metaphysics, Metaphysics Lambda, hanging over the Gorgias commentary in lecture 42. It is necessary to imitate the whole cosmos, and in the cosmos as whole there is one ruler. Who is this? The God, presuming that it is not a good thing that to have many rulers. Let there be one ruler. The famous quotation. Less Aristotelian, though, is material that we find in the prologue of the Gorgias commentary. Hogas Socrates monada mimetai pros to hen horon. Socrates imitates a monad looking towards the one, for God is simple and being brought forth out of nothing, or not being brought forth out of anything. So here it looks as if we might be about to get a little bit more upon the traditional Neoplatonic one as a supreme God. But this God, the very first God, though, is simple. This may merely mean that he is one, not is the one. Perhaps even the one would be too much like a name for Olympiodorus, for just a little later, for we too know that the one first cause is God. For the first things are not many, and this first thing has not even chance to have a name, for names are indicative of certain particular properties of things. And one may also recall here a little snippet from the Alcibiades commentary, that the henaska ortheos kai henoides, lecture 51 of the Alcibiades commentary. If henoides means the single member of his kind, then here too Olympiodorus does not call his God the one, so that he remains one without ever really becoming the one. This God is intimately involved in the cosmos, as we see from various passages now, including on the Gorgias, lecture 39, for he says that the cosmos is our city and the ruler is God. So it is necessary to assimilate ourselves to the God and to the cosmos, and to live according to that constitution and not towards this one of ours. God is the cosmic ruler, and it's a cosmic ruler who illuminates the cosmos, as we find out on the Gorgias lecture 48. So in this particular case, just like as the light illuminates by its very activity, so too the God in his very activity cosmically creates, cosmopoieia. Other attributes of God here, his goodness is not surprising, as we found also in Asclepius, and because he is good, perhaps God does nothing in vain any more than nature does anything in vain. On the Gorgias lecture 50, and another thing that he has is an eternal nature rather than an everlasting one. The two are distinguished in the Meteorologica commentary at 146. So as a result of which we say that God is eternal on account of his not being in time, but basically is there for all time, both present and past and future, he says that we don't call him everlasting since he does not even have his being in time. So there's a selection of what we are told in Olympiodorus about God. We get a general feeling that this could be something like the demiurge of the Timaeus. I think that general, it's by no means as clear as that it actually is in Asclepius, and presumably in Ammonius before Asclepius. But of course, to be fair, Olympiodorus was not looking at texts that would have required a great deal of metaphysical comment. For example, one thing that's missing here in Olympiodorus is any real idea of the relationship of God to the ideas. As we saw, he was probably reluctant to talk of a plurality of gods when writing the Gorgias commentary, as Asclepius clearly had been, but he feels much more freedom to do so as time went on, though never in such a way, I think, as to upset a partially Christian audience. While insisting on the unity and the goodness of God, he will not refer to him as the one or the good either. This is Platonism almost in a very loose sense, without the neo, I think. And if one sometimes doubts any strong commitment to Platonism even in Olympiodorus, then one should doubt also any strong commitment to Aristotle, whose influence becomes a little less obvious over time. However monotheistic Olympiodorus may appear, that monotheism cannot, I think, be directly attributed to the influence of the Aristotelian unmoved mover, though that may have been the case for Asclepius and for Ammonius before him. Rather, what I think we're seeing, I'm afraid, is a little bit of Olympiodorus's philosophic caution, and probably a philosophical caution of a kind which he doesn't talk about in the commentaries on the Phaedo and the Meteorologica, one which is cautious about reveal too much of his philosophical hand in an atmosphere where members of his audience could take offense to anything that he said out of place. So he will say what he needs to say in relation to the texts that he's got before him, but a lot of the time he is not going to say very much more than that. And I don't think I should say very much more than that either. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this exciting talk. We have plenty of time for discussion, so please, if there are, I'm sure there are questions and remarks, so well, you can either use the chat or raise hand. I think John Finamore.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you anyway.
That's the most important thing. Oh, I should put my camera on too, if I can do it. There we go. Okay, this business about God and nous that comes up in, what is that, passage H?
Yep.
Okay, and he tries to explain that by saying we sort of actualize ourselves somehow cathartically through one of these and contemplatively through another. Do you think that might be kind of like Proclus's, there's the nous at the bottom that's the actual intellect and God that does things, and we get to him first, but there's a higher intellect and up in the triad that's made up of his realm, and we want to get to that one too. So he's not talking about the one and intellect. He's talking about lower intellect and highest aspect, right, of intellect. Would that get him back into the Neoplatonic column?
Yeah, possibly. And one thing that I should have said, I don't know why it's not there. I think it probably was in my text, but I was sort of jumping between text and handout, is that what I feel is that he makes that distinction in particular in relation to the human mind. So he's telling Alcibiades to look into my soul, right?
Right.
Looking into my soul, and you're going to see two things. You're going to see nous and you're going to see God, and both are there in the text. So, I mean, he's got an excuse for doing this. And he's seeing nous is obviously something primarily intellective here, as it's responsible for the common notions. Whereas as God is something that we get excited about. So if one can get excited about Olympiodorus gods, I don't know about that. But I think it's important that what you've got are two forces in the human mind. Now, it's probably easier to differentiate between Kronos and Zeus for Olympiodorus while he's talking about forces in the human mind. If he's talking about forces out there in the cosmos, then I think he would in that case be a lot more reluctant to make the distinction. And remember that although he does make a distinction, he's not telling us whether this is a theoretical distinction or whether it's a real distinction between two different things. So he doesn't go out of his way to show us that he is separating God from Nous at this point. But I mean, I think so. Yes, there could be, if assuming that the demiurge must be regarded in some way as Nous, and that the demiurge is in some way the highest god, and there's got to be Nous in us as well. It could be that Nous is actually thought of as being at a lower level and God at a higher level in this passage here. It's a matter of what Olympiodorus doesn't reveal.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
I think Professor Shepard and
okay, I'm not quite sure whether I'm next, but thank you. Yes, no, that was really interesting, Harold. Thank you. And I mean, one of the things I found really interesting was the way that you're finding a way of putting Olympiodorus commentaries into some kind of chronological order. And I could see that about the move away from syllogistic and also the work you've obviously done on the language of them. I wasn't completely convinced that this was some kind of move away from the influence of Ammonius to being more influenced by people in the Athenian school. I mean, the problem about that is that Ammonius himself was a pupil of Proclus. And I mean, just to be difficult about it, just because Ammonius survived in commentaries on Aristotle, I'm not myself convinced that means Ammonius was not very interested in Plato. So, and the passages that you've got about God, I mean, they're from, some of them from the Gorgias commentary, some of them from the Alcibiades commentary. So I think I need a bit more, can you do a bit more to persuade me that this is some kind of move away from some sort of Alexandrian Neoplatonism towards something Athenian? I mean, I suppose what I'm questioning whether there's really a distinction between the two, I guess.
Yeah. I think, first of all, whereas I think that there's a general movement towards independence on Olympiodorus's Olympiodorus's part. What I don't think is that is a greater move to all the time towards away from Ammonius and towards the Athenian school. I think you may be getting a bit of a curve here. The signs of the influence of Damascius are probably greatest in the Alcibiades commentary, although it still seems that there's a little bit of probably Damascian Orphic stuff in the Phaedo commentary. Or we don't have quite enough of that. But one should remember that he refers to Ammonius a lot in the Meteorologica commentary. So he's by no means moving away from acknowledging his debt to Ammonius throughout his life. How far is it Platonic? I mean, I think that certainly Ammonius was interested in the Gorgias. We can see that from the Gorgias commentary. So the number of times he's referred to in a way that sheds a little light. There's some sort of personal anecdotes, but there's a bit that refers to his attitude to Plato, I think. So what I feel is that under Ammonius, there was a tendency rather to, at least for the school, the wider school, perhaps not for a narrower circle, but for the wider school to rather forget Plato. Eutychius may have taken over the school, and Eutychius seems to have had some interest in Aristotle, but also to be particularly a mathematician, and precisely what interest he would have had in Plato, I have no idea. But it does at least seem that by the time that the school has a reasonable Platonic profile by the time you get to David. And I think that Platonic profile must have been built up again, in part by Olympiodorus. And I think part of that building up is building up an epistemology that is more plausibly Platonic than might have been in evidence in the Gorgias commentary. But it is difficult, and I grant you that here and there I'm building on hints, and that's all that I can find. And I still have more work to do. I mean, when you've been working on Olympiodorus for what, something like 30 years, you can still find a lot more work that you've got to do before you feel as confident as you should do.
Okay, thank you. No, that makes the picture clearer. I think I was perhaps not quite grasping some of the nuances of what you were saying, so thank you.
Thank you. I think that Professor Chrysakopoulou, Silvana is next, but I apologize if I do not keep the order. It depends on when I see the raised hand.
Don't worry. Thank you, Irini, and thank you, Harold. Good evening, and thank you for accepting our invitations in Greece.
Not at all. It's nice to be there. It's nice to be there virtually, if in no other form.
Yes, thank you. So,
Kalimera sas. Or Kalispera, I should say.
Kalispera, again, because I saw you in the morning. So, I wanted to ask you a question on your translation of the word eulabeia, Evlavia, of the Greeks. And the reason why I'm asking is, although the term from the Hellenistic times on means what you pointed out, this sense of cautiousness, I believe that if we go back to the Platonic text, and I remember some instances by heart, like in the Sophist, in the Gigantomachy, or then in the Phaedo, when he talks about the Uranian notions of God, the planets and all that, he uses the term eulabeia in a different context, which is more religious and closer to piety, to devoutness. And I wonder whether we could draw this notion from especially if you contextualize it the way you do. If we could replace the word cautiousness with a more religious term.
Yeah. Such as just
devoutness, piety. It's strong. I know it's stronger. And
almost reverence.
Yes, reverence. Yes. Because this implies some respect to the divine feeling, notion, whatever. And it goes back to the Platonic texts, both in the Sophist and in the Phaedo and other texts. I don't know what you think about that.
And I suppose what you would argue is that because the human being is less perfect in knowledge than God is,
exactly.
One always ought to have a certain reverence and cautiousness together, as it were, when dealing with one's own knowledge. Because it's sort of immodest to try and elevate one's own knowledge above a certain point. That doesn't constitute skepticism, but it's sort of like a tiny step towards it, maybe.
Exactly. That's what I wish. Yeah. Thank you.
Professor Altman?
Yes, thanks. I think the spirit of my question runs kind of counter to what Silvana just immediately said about eulabesthei. Is that, I mean, Plato clearly uses the word. I'm thinking specifically at Republic 6, 507, where Socrates says, eulabesthei, lest I deceive you. So it's a standard Platonic word for warning and calling for caution. And here's my question, Harold. Do you see any evidence in Olympiodorus's commentaries on Plato that he is aware that caution is required from an interpreter of Plato? Because Plato cryptein phile and is perfectly capable of giving you a warning about an account to come that is in context, thanks to the warning, flagged as something about which we should be cautious, that we should scopometha me, exapatesis by, or something along those lines. And whether that your account of eulabeia at the beginning of the paper, it struck me, was primarily epistemological. I'm curious if you would be willing to find any evidence in Olympiodorus of a rather more hermeneutic eulabeia that is required from a good interpreter of Plato, which I take it that certainly in a comparative sense, Olympiodorus is. A hermeneutic element or aspect of eulabeia in Olympiodorus, yes or no, Harold?
That's rather interesting. I don't think he very often wants to undermine his own authority, as it were, as a teacher. And probably the note taker wouldn't have wanted to undermine his authority either by including too many hints that he might have dropped. But the one thing you can say is that in the life of Plato, I think in the life of Plato in the Alcibiades commentary, as well as in the anonymous Prolegomena, which is the one other Platonic work from this school, may possibly be Olympiodorus himself or somebody close to him. If you take them, both of them have this story about the difficulty of interpreting Plato, don't they? How he turned into a swan and nobody could catch him. And it was supposed to illustrate the difficulty of interpreting him. I should go back and check on these lives, because I'm not so sure, but I don't. Occasionally, an alternative interpretation of a few words are given, so that he won't just say this and that. He might say this or that sometimes. And at one rather important point, from my point of view, Dodds makes the error of saying that Olympiodorus says that a charadrion was a bird that excretes at the same time that it eats. And in fact, if you look at Olympiodorus, he gives two alternative explanations. One, that it is such a bird, sometimes identified as a plover and others as a stone curlew, which seems to be more likely. But the alternative explanation is that it's actually the rocky gully itself, and in fact it's the diminutive of Haradra, and that it is it's just referring to the rocky gully. So you are getting the life of a stone, which Callicles accuses Socrates' life of being, contrasted with the life of a rocky gully, which Socrates accuses Callicles' life of being. But sorry, I didn't need to go into that, but at least it's an example of Olympiodorus offering you alternatives in the interpretation of a particular passage. He doesn't mind doing that if he's not absolutely certain which one applies. Okay.
Well, I think that Professor Baldley has a question.
Hi, Harold. Sometimes people distinguish between monotheism and henotheism, both of which seem to be in some tension with polytheism, whereas monotheism is the view that there is uniquely one God. Henotheism is the view that there is one supreme God or one divine principle and a plurality of other divinities that are subordinate or derivative from it in some way. Now, it's fairly easy to sort the monotheists from the polytheists. It's less easy to sort the monotheists from the henotheists, because they can say things that will sound agreeable to monotheists, because after all, we all agree that in some sense there is one God. And the only way in which to sort of sort them, I think, is to ask further questions about divine attributes and whether the exercise of providence that's characteristic of a God or a God's goodness is uniquely instantiated, or whether, as it were, there's a whole catering team looking after the joint.
Yeah.
Now, I wasn't sure that any of the texts that you gave us were things that a henotheist looking to keep the peace couldn't easily write.
Yeah. And I would have said as well that, you know, you can have shades of henotheism. It is possible for, if supposing Olympiodorus, shall we say, he is on the side of monotheism there, but he could be looking and saying, well, really, I do acknowledge other divine powers operating in us, etc. And so technically I'm a henotheist in that sense. But couldn't I also regard Proclus as a henotheist? However many gods he may have altogether, are they not all derived from the one which is the origin of all and the origin of all goodness? So if it's the origin of all goodness, then it is the ultimate agent of all pronoia, is it not? So I mean, it is a way of trying to reconcile Olympiodorus a bit more with the Proclan position, and still see, and still being able to see why he doesn't upset the Christian community any more than he does.
So one thing that might be an interesting sort of test case is recall that Asclepius passage where the younger gods seem to be elided into ta Urania.
Yeah.
Right. If you find similar illusions in texts of Olympiodorus, then what you've got is the henotheism that dare not speak its name. Right, because those beings are clearly doing demiurgic labor in a way that it looks less congenial to a monotheistic context. So if I were looking to locate him along a sort of spectrum here, I'd be looking at whether you're seeing that kind of move made in Olympiodorus as well.
I don't see that move made, but I could still find something. I wouldn't put it past me to find something that did illuminate the question. It's, as I say, the problem is that Olympiodorus seems reluctant to get too far into theological issues that are not demanded by this text that he's interpreting it at any given time. And I think that's what holds us up, and makes it difficult. I mean, there are two things that you've always got to bear in mind. One there's Olympiodorus's own beliefs. 2, there's the beliefs of Olympiodorus's audience, and the text is going to be something that tries and somehow to match up 1 with 2. Exactly how many concessions Olympiodorus is really feels he's making when he's addressing a Christian audience is not entirely clear to me, even at this stage. Okay.
Well, I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
If I may.
Why not?
So the first one is about text C. So I wonder whether when Olympiodorus says that Plato called the syllogistic method a myth, so whether he could point not only to lack of trust in syllogistic, but to the philosophical value of myth, and whether one could think that this is within the framework of the agreement symphonia between Plato and Aristotle, in the sense that he could be saying that what the Peripatetics expressed through the syllogistic method, Plato does it through myth. So these are perhaps 2 different ways or methods, but they do not point to an essential difference. So they do not point to disagreement. They are just different as methods. So this is the first question.
Yeah.
And the second one is very short, so I can perhaps say this as well. So it is about text number 8. I was interested in this term, Taurania, because I cannot recall its use. So the choice of the term seems interesting to me. I can only recall Thei Uraniones in Orphic poetry, but I wonder whether he could have from which kind of sources Asclepius could have borrowed this very neutral term that does not upset the Christians.
Right. Okay. Now, on that, first of all, I do find it interesting that Asclepius has used this term, and it surprises me that something in the neuter plural like this could be actually used as a periphrasis for the young gods of the Timaeus. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure what to make of it, whether it is a term very carefully chosen by Asclepius, as it might be, or whether it does have some history in the Timaeus tradition of interpreting the Timaeus. I have to look carefully into that one before I came to any conclusions. But I mean, I think it's a very good question as to why ta Urania is being used here, and what its use signifies. As for passage C, it could tell us something more about Muthos, but I think it's clear. It's clear that Olympiodorus did not have as elevated a view of myth as the Athenian school did. So in the Gorgias commentary, I think it's chapter 45, says that a myth is nothing other than a false logos imitating the true. So, if it's a false logos, then that it doesn't look as if calling a syllogism a myth would be particularly flattering, even if it does come somewhere near to the truth. So I think one's got to take Olympiodorus' attitude to myth into consideration here. And I think that when one does, one sees that also that to call Aristotle ho peripatos probably is not terribly flattering. And then to use the verb semnunatai, prides himself, I think that's probably not terribly flattering either. So I think I'll probably stick to my guns regarding passage C, even though, you know, if this was somebody with a different concept of myth, then it would say a Plutarch, for example, Plutarch of Chaeronea, that is. I think calling a syllogism a myth would be an entirely different thing. But and again, I think there's no real reason why to invite such a comment at all, unless Olympiodorus wanted to make a slightly nasty point here, because where are we? It's Phaedo. Oh, so probably my talk has the actual reference to the Phaedo passage that's relevant here, but I think it's diamuthologoumai, a verb that actually attracts this comment, and let me, sorry, it's here. If we just look it up in Westerink, that'll be all right. It's Westerink 10.3, 1-6. Lecture 9, lecture 10, 10.1-2, 10.3, 1-6. Yes, this is, the Lexis is 70b6, and the Lexis being 70b6, Yes, that's right. It's dia mythologomen. And Plato doesn't even use the word mythos. He uses this compound verb that, as it were, includes the root mythos, but probably is not implying a myth like logos at all. And this is being seized upon by Olympiodorus for some purpose that he wishes to underline here, for what we might call reasons that aren't purely academic. For purely academic reasons, you would not comment on this word, and you would certainly not comment on it in terms of what's a mythos and what isn't. So that's as I read it.
Thank you. I can go on for a while, perhaps, because before Pandeli's question, because I wonder first, how do you translate the mythologomen in the Phaedo? Do you think it refers to myth, or it has something to do with discussion in general? And second, in the Olympiodorus passage.
Yes, I think it's more to do with discussion in general. And the dia must mean something continuing, probably emphasizing continuation. And I wouldn't have thought mythos meant anything very different from its sense in Homer within the context of that verb. But there we are. It's not uncharacteristic of the Neoplatonists to seize on something, some hint that something being said is a myth. It happens in relation to the palinode of the Phaedrus in Hermias. I think it's about 253. Yes, Plato says 253c, Pathapa en arche tuditu muthu trice dielomem sucene castain, as we divided, just as we divided at the beginning of this myth, the soul into three. And Hermias jumps on this and says, why does he call it a myth? Hermias is not at all sure. In fact, it doesn't seem that the palinode of the Phaedrus was so regularly regarded as a myth in Neoplatonism as it is today. Yes, obviously the terminology of myth, any hint of the terminology of myth is somehow important to these people in a way that it might not be to us nowadays.
Thank you. May I add, o peripatos, do you think that it refers to Aristotle himself, or could Olympiodorus be pointing to some Aristotelian scholars of his time who, in a way, separate Plato from Aristotle? And perhaps I'm thinking of Philoponus in a way, thus attacking the agreement between Athens and Alexandria, the schools of Athens, and between Plato and Aristotle in the schools of Athens.
that's an interesting suggestion as well, and I hadn't really considered that one, and I would be happy to give it further. Yes, I mean, actually, Westering just refers to the peripatos in his translation, so regarding it as the school rather than Aristotle. To call it the school could have in mind recent Aristotelians in just the same way as Aristotle. So question it, I mean, I suppose the school did pride itself on syllogistic because yeah, there's a great deal of attention is given to the organon itself in Alexandrian Platonism, in Alexandrian philosophy, I should say, and maybe, I mean, are there any cases of referring to somebody like Philoponus as a peripatetic or as an Aristotelian rather than anything else? I think probably not, but who knows precisely what he's got in the back of his mind here. But perhaps it is in fact a little bit more to do with polemic against people who are still alive than polemic against Aristotle himself. That would work, I think.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Padeli?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that, well, I have a different observation to make, but I think that the problem there in that phrase that you were discussing is not the peripatos, but the semninetai.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is the magnification of logic somehow, of syllogistic matter. And I would say that neither Philoponus nor anyone, for that matter, would have that opinion. So these peripatetics must be some earlier peripatetics who taught only logic and thought that philosophy somehow culminated in logic. So I mean,
I would doubt whether Philoponus would be somebody who prided himself upon syllogistic in particular.
Yeah, absolutely not. I mean,
yeah, but there would be some people in the history of the peripatetics. I guess the reason why I thought it might refer to Aristotle himself is that one could also refer. It might be more normal just to refer to hoi peripatetikoi and have a plural. If you really have more than one person in mind, whereas we have got this the peripatos in much the same way as you refer to the stoa, I suppose, or the academy, for that matter.
But okay, thank you. Yeah, but I would like to know more about something you said in the beginning.
Yeah.
Namely that if I understood you correctly, that Olympiodorus somehow subverted the traditional reading of the Parmenides as being the theological dialogue.
Yeah,
and that he replaced the Parmenides with the Timaeus in that respect, which is very intriguing, but is well, if this is what you meant, because this is contradicted by Olympiodorus himself, who when he discusses his the place of the Alcibiades in the taxis, in the order of reading the
the Parmenides being the
Avita. Yeah. He compares Alcibiades to the Propylaia and Parmenides to the Agita, the inner sanctuary, and this takes over the traditional reading of the Parmenides.
Yeah. How do I react to that passage? Obviously, it's an important passage, but I'm going more by the fact that the Parmenides is traditionally written in the lean style. That's the isknos, whereas the Prolegomena specifically says that Plato uses the rich style, the hydros, in his theological dialogues, which brings me to suppose that they have not really got a theological interpretation of the Parmenides any longer. Can still be a very important dialogue, although there is a strange reference to the Parmenides when the Charmides is actually meant at one point, as if they could get these things muddled up. It was probably something that they dare not publicly teach if they really did believe that it had a theological meaning. And I just think you certainly couldn't stick to Asclepius's kind of language and still believe in the radically polytheistic interpretation of the second hypothesis that Syrianus had proposed, for example. My article is more about how the Parmenides is forgotten than than anything that you know it somehow disappears, right? And I think when talking about the language of dialogues, the anonymous Prolegomena does forget the Parmenides if the Parmenides was still thought to be theological in some way. But there we are. I mean, I'm not saying that my arguments here are 100% waterproof, I'll have to go and have another look at the contrast of the Alcibiades with the Parmenides, as far as the sort of the entry point and the inner sanctum is concerned. But I think you can still have a pretty exalted view of the Parmenides, even if you regard it as essentially a dialogue about forms still. Because the intelligibles are still going to be a very important thing if the theory of koinai enoi are dependent upon a theory of intelligibles, as I would expect them to be in Olympiodorus. How does that sound?
Thank you.
I think there is one last question, perhaps, Silvana.
I'm sorry if you're not very tired. I just wanted to draw upon what you said, Irini, on the question of mythos in regard to syllogism. And I just wanted to refer to two passages you brought in mind from Plato, one from the Sophist, when he uses the words, when he refers to Xenophanes as the first one who talked about the one, in order to go back to henotheism, he says, ως ενός όντως των πάντων κανουμένων, ούτως διεξάρχεται tois mythos. And though we talk about the mythoi in an epic sense in the previous passages when he talks about the pluralists, when he refers to another way of dealing, let's say, with the myths, but he used the word diexerchetai, in regard to one, then actually we cannot have a myth when we talk about the one. So about the notheism or about oneness. So in a way, it is impossible to have anything else but a syllogism. Okay, I'm happy for your reaction. But then we have a similar, let's say, suggestion in the Republic when he coins the words theologia in response to mythologia. And I believe that in Plato, this word myth is always drawn towards the direction of a logos, of a syllogism or whatever.
Okay. I think when it comes to talking about the whole of myth in Plato,
yes, okay.
Ime curas menos.
Yes. Okay. Okay.
I think there's no time for that.
Yes. Thank you. Sorry.
But it's an interesting observation anyway. Thanks, Silvana.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Harold, I'm really sorry that you are tired, but this shows how exciting your talk has been. And as far as I am concerned, I could go on and on, but I think we'd rather stop. Yeah, and thank you once again, both for your talk and for the discussion, for answering all these questions. And I hope to see you very soon again online. Our next meeting is on the 1st of December, and Professor D'Ancona is going to talk on Aristotelian ethics between Alexandria and Baghdad this time. So see you on the 1st of December, and Harold, thank you very much again.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody, for being here and for the discussion.